Hey, breaking points. Marshall here. A lot of folks have been asking breaking points to cover the topic of inflation from a bunch of different angles. So I thought, what better than to speak to an expert who's been writing about the Federal Reserve and its role in the current crisis. I'm speaking with Chris Leonard. He is the author of The Lords of Easy Money: How the Federal Reserve Broke the American Economy. You've got an interesting take here. I'd love you just to sum up as we start what the current just political consensus is regarding Joe Biden, the Federal Reserve, like who's to blame for the current economic system we're in right now?
Yeah, so obviously right now, in the summer of 2022, before a midterm election, we are seeing just tremendous economic volatility. And not to put too fine a point on it, but we're watching sort of a slow motion stock market crash. Just this week, the Standard and Poor's 500, for example, entered what they call bear market territory. And really, this is just the beginning of a lot of economic readjustment and downward asset prices that we're going to see over the next year. So we're seeing kind of an economic calamity unfold at probably the worst possible time for the Biden administration and for the Democrats who control Congress. I mean, the political conventional wisdom is very simple. When you have economic turmoil like this during the midterm year, it really helps the party out of power. The most likely outcome is that this will sort of be rocket fuel to the Republican attempts to take over Congress this fall. But what I'm trying to say is that this sort of economic earthquake we're seeing this year with super high inflation and with the stock market crash, the ground has been set for this for years. What we're seeing is the expression of a years long situation that really has very little to do with who's been in the White House for the last 17 months or so.
And what's interesting here then is what about the fact that there are prominent Democrats like Larry Summers, who last year were saying we're on the path to inflation, these big economic issues, and they weren't focused on the Federal Reserve though. So how do you think about it, the fact that it's not just Republicans saying this is Biden's spending decisions, but also some centrist Democrats as well too?
Well, yeah, what I think what you're getting at is what is the root of the inflation here? And you've got some folks on the Democratic side saying, hey, it was this government spending, particularly the COVID relief plans that pumped a ton of money into what we call the real economy, in the sense that, the federal government was sending checks to people were buying more stuff, demand was really high, and that fed inflation. That's fiscal responsibility. That's what happens with Congress and the Treasury. But let's not forget what's going on with monetary policy, with the Federal Reserve and the so-called money supply. That's a key part of this story. Now, when we're talking about Larry Summers' complaints, we're not going to really figure out, honestly, how much of a role the federal spending had in this inflation for years. It's going to take a long time to kind of do the autopsy on this disaster of the high inflation. What we do know for a fact is that the Federal Reserve Bank has made this situation much worse than it otherwise would be. And that was because of policy decisions the Fed made over the last decade to keep interest rates at zero while pumping trillions of dollars into the banking system, which pumped up stock prices and created major asset bubbles. So what that means is that today, as the Fed tries to fight inflation, as it tries to hike interest rates and it tries to draw this money out of the banking system, it's going to create a massive downturn in the financial markets. That's why we're seeing very fast, very rapid downturns, not just in stocks, but in bonds and other assets.
So if this is a almost multi-decade story of
Yeah.
bad Federal Reserve policies, what are we being Joe Biden, we being a Republican Congress, we being maybe President Trump or President DeSantis in 2024, what can actually be done to address this issue?
Okay. So first of all, unfortunately, I think one of the big points of what I've come to from reporting this is that there's no easy way out of the position where we are now. And I want to sort of restate here that the Federal Reserve and our central bank is incredibly powerful and incredibly influential. And I think folks really need to pay attention to what the Fed did between 2010 and 2020. The Fed reshaped our financial system It kept interest rates pegged at zero for roughly a decade with one small intermission. That's never been done before. It is hugely consequential. And at the same time, the Fed was pumping trillions of dollars into the banking system through this program called quantitative easing. This all had a huge effect.
Why did they, and quick question, why did they do those two things?
Huge question. The Fed took on a what I would call really a super activist role after 2010. And, we were emerging from a banking crisis back then, of course. Economic growth was weak, unemployment was high. And the chairman of the Fed was Ben Bernanke, whose memoir is entitled The Courage to Act. And I think that tells you everything you need to know about his sort of philosophy. And the Bernanke theory was, hey, we got to do whatever we can to try to stimulate economic growth. And that sounds great, of course, but look at the tools the Fed has. The Fed can't put a shovel in anybody's hand. It can't educate a kid. It can't build a dam. All the Fed can do is create new money on Wall Street. All this new money that the Fed creates is created inside the bank accounts of 24 banks on Wall Street. So the Fed pushed these policies really as kind of like a jobs program. It was sort of like this modern New Deal, if you will. It was a jobs program through the vehicle of pumping cash into Wall Street while keeping interest rates at zero to promote more lending and frankly, riskier lending.
So the question then would become, and I know you're having, read your book, which we did a great realignment episode with you. The point of your perspective is not to just excuse the Biden administration in terms of its economic approach or its actions. How would you just articulate or say the administration's performance on these economic issues has been since 2021 when they assumed office?
I'm not trying to write an apologia for the Biden administration at all. I'm not. What I think the message I really want to deliver is 17 months is a very small time frame when you look at America's political economy. And the Biden administration has not been in office that long. When you're looking at a time frame of 10 years, it has not been that long. And we could talk a lot about what the administration has done. It passed the 1.9 trillion COVID Relief Act very quickly after it got into office. It tried to pass a much more ambitious spending plan and Build Back Better, which of course never took. But these policies haven't had an enormous and consequential effect. That's what I'm trying to say here is, the American political cycle is on these little 2-year increments. And that's not enough time to create significant change in the country. So the Biden administration is in many significant ways just starting to get its feet on the ground. I mean, the personnel have been in place for maybe a year. You're starting to see some new actions from the Federal Trade Commission and other bodies, but the effect has been shallow. It has not been deep. That's my take on it. So when we look particularly at some of the economic carnage that is not just unfolding now on the stock market, but is probably yet to come, you can't simply describe why that's happening by pointing at a White House administration that's only about a year and a half into the job.
And the way I'd sum up your perspective, I like your use of the word autopsy earlier. So maybe when someone like you writes a book about this decade in 2035 or something, the story isn't going to focus as much on spending decisions during a 9-month period before Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema got started. It's going to be during this 2010s post 2008 financial crisis period up through the present day, the Federal Reserve, separate from the Trump administration, separate from the Obama administration, separate from the Biden administration, obviously the chairmans are, appointed by the administrations, is going to play just a huge, is that a good way of summing up the way we should probably think about this moment?
I think it's a perfect way to sum it up. And I was also being pretty specific too, in the sense that one of the key dynamics we're seeing right now is incredibly high inflation, shockingly high inflation above 8%, which has really caught everybody by surprise, even Larry Summers, to the degree that it's happened and the degree to which it's embedded. I'm very fascinated with the previous period of very high inflation in the 1970s. And what I learned from studying that era is it took a solid 30 years to do that autopsy where you're really going back and trying to distinguish, okay, what caused this? Why did this happen at this moment? Why did it happen so severely? And as we look at this moment, it probably will take a while to figure out, okay, how much did the COVID relief play into this? How much did the supply chain bottleneck caused by COVID play into this? How much did the Fed's monetary policy play into this? It's going to take a while to figure that out. But to the point you made, yes, the key thing to understand are the sort of the deep infrastructure of our economy and our political economic system. The central bank, the dysfunction we see in the democratic institutions like Congress and the White House over the last 15 years, that's going to play a critical role in it for sure. And there is simply no doubt, that when historians look back at this period right now in 2022, they're going to talk about the previous decade of what the Fed did. It is hard to describe it without sounding hyperbolic. The Fed quintupled the monetary base in our country. They printed 5 times as much money in a decade as they printed in a century. That's an enormous change, and it's had huge effects. And it's one reason why we're seeing this volatility we're seeing today.
Christopher, I'd love for you to close on this final question. Like you said, you've studied this 70s, 80s period, and that's really coming towards the end of the New Deal era. It's coming towards the end of the Great Society, just the inflation issue in terms of reducing the ambitions of government to positively impact the economy. That's a huge political issue in this country. Now that we're coming out of the COVID moment, now that we're coming out of this moment where it seemed as if Joe Biden could be the next FDR, can you just give us just like your political analysis of how inflation politics and this just spending dynamic is going to play a role in basically constraining government? I mean, giving my perspective, but like it seems that this is going to really constrain government in an unexpected level, given how people thought COVID was going to reshape everything when it came to the system.
I think that's right, and I think that I don't want to sound alarmist, but there's some fundamental things at play here. Inflation politics is very explosive. When you look back at countries that experience high inflation, Turkey's going through it right now. We've been through this in the 1970s. Other nations have experienced hyperinflation. It's terribly.
Which nation experienced hyperinflation?
I like to stay away from talking about hyperinflation in the 1930s. Not to be cute about it, but it's obvious that hyperinflation in the 1930s led to the destruction of democracy in Germany. It's a very instructive, kind of scary profile to read about, not just because of the rise of fascism. I mean, of course, because this is why I don't like talking about this. The effects of inflation are incredibly destructive politically. People lose faith in institutions. It makes it harder and harder to get by. It really stokes social instability and anger in the short term, for sure. And to me, what's important is the moment in which this is hitting. You talked about the inflation in the 1970s kind of being one of the nails in the coffin of the New Deal. That is absolutely what happened, and that is accurate. And I think we all kind of recognize that the sort of the political landscape in America today is changing. There's kind of the death of one political order, and we're looking at the creation of another potentially. And these midterm elections, it doesn't just feel anymore like this very predictable, safe seesaw between kind of conservative Republicans and more liberal Democrats. Like that consensus is gone, and a lot of the guardrails or leavening effects aren't there anymore. And so to me, what's important is that this is hitting our country at a moment when things are already acknowledged to be fragile, politically fragile. We hear so much about the lack of strength of our institutions and the political volatility that we're seeing. So I think it's really, really, really important to pay attention to how this economic volatility can play into our political system.
Very well said. Christopher, we'd love for you just to shout the book out for folks who want to go deeper into this topic and reference any recent op-eds you've written.
Well, I would say, look, at the risk of being predictable, the Lords of Easy Money, this book I wrote, really tries to calmly walk through the last decade of monetary policy. And obviously, I think it helps explain to a large extent why we're seeing what we're seeing economically right now, and what the effects have been. And again, I just think we need to be really clear-eyed as we look at this stuff so that we can make the best judgments we can make as citizens as to like which way we should go forward and what policies we should support.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us on Breaking Points.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.